Welcome back to our channel. Today's diary is about flight wasn't lost because something broke. It was lost because something human happened. The aircraft entered the night. Without warning, anyone on board that this would be the last ordinary moment of their lives. Inside the cabin, the lights were dimmed to a soft amber glow. Passengers slept, watched silent movies, or stared into nothing, comforted by the steady hum of engines that had carried millions safely across oceans before. Seatbelts lay loose. Shoes were off. Blankets were pulled up to chins. Everything felt routine, familiar, almost boring. 35,000 feet below, the Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly, black and invisible. Above it, the sky appeared calm from a distance, but far ahead, towering clouds were growing into something violent and unforgiving. In the cockpit, the mood was professional and quiet. Instruments glowed softly. The autopilot held the aircraft steady, correcting tiny movements no human hand could feel. The plane was healthy. Its engines were strong. Its wings were clean. Nothing about this flight suggested danger. Yet, high-altitude storms are deceptive. They do not roar. They do not shake until it is too late. They wait patiently, building ice where humans cannot see it, preparing confusion rather than destruction. As the aircraft approached the storm line, the air began to change. Subtle vibrations passed through the fuselage. Not enough to wake most passengers. Not enough to cause alarm. Just enough to whisper that something was different. Then, without drama, the autopilot disengaged. There was no explosion, no sudden dive, just a quiet chime and a message on the screen. The plane was now in human hands. At cruising altitude, this is the moment pilots train for but rarely experience. The air is thin. The margin for error is narrow. Movements that feel small can have enormous consequences. Almost immediately, the cockpit displays stopped agreeing with one another. Airspeed indicators conflicted. One showed a dangerous drop. Another showed stability. A third fluctuated wildly. The information the pilots relied on to understand reality had fractured into pieces that no longer fit together. Outside, ice crystals invisible to the naked eye were clogging sensors. Not permanently, not fatally. Just long enough to confuse. Confusion is the most dangerous condition in aviation. The aircraft still flying normally began to feel wrong. Controls responded sluggishly. The nose drifted. Alarms whispered warnings that did not explain themselves. The human brain, under stress, searches for patterns it recognizes. When speed appears to drop, instinct says pull up. When altitude feels threatened, instinct says climb. Instinct is useful on the ground. In the sky, instinct can betray you. The control column moved backward. The nose lifted. At first, nothing dramatic happened. The plane did not fall. The engines did not fail. In fact, everything seemed momentarily better. The perceived threat of descent appeared solved. But aerodynamics are unforgiving to misunderstanding. As the nose rose, the wings began to lose the smooth airflow they needed to generate lift. Not suddenly. Not violently, slowly. Quietly. A stall does not always announce itself. Inside the cabin, a few passengers shifted in their seats. A glass rattled on a tray table. Someone tightened their blanket. No one screamed. No one panicked. The aircraft still felt like an aircraft, but the laws of physics had already taken control. The stall warning sounded, then stopped, then sounded again, then stopped again. To the pilots, it made no sense. How could the plane be stalling if it felt like it was falling? How could it be falling if the nose was up? The conflicting information overloaded the mind, replacing clear thought with urgency. Hands tightened. Breathing quickened. The ocean below remained unseen, uncaring. The most heartbreaking part of this moment was not fear. It was potential. The aircraft was not broken. The engines were still producing thrust. The wings were still intact. A single correct realization, lowering the nose, trusting fundamentals, could have returned the plane to safety. But confusion had closed that door. The aircraft climbed just enough to lose more lift. Then it began to fall. Not like a stone, like a wounded bird that does not yet know it cannot fly. Minutes passed. In aviation, minutes can mean the difference between a story of survival and a lesson written in black. Boxes and memorials. Inside the cabin, the first signs of panic appeared. Loose objects drifted. Passengers sensed something wrong without understanding it. Some woke suddenly. Others prayed. Many simply held on. No one knew how close they were to being saved. Above the Atlantic in total darkness, the plane continued descending, engines roaring, wings stalled, alarms crying out into a cockpit filled with unanswered questions. And still the most tragic truth remained hidden. The mistake was small. The consequence would be final. The descent did not feel like a fall. It felt like uncertainty stretching itself across time, slowing every second while quietly accelerating the inevitable. The aircraft remained intact, its engines still pushing air behind them, its wings still wide against the night. To anyone unfamiliar with flight physics, it looked like survival was still possible, even likely. That illusion was the most dangerous thing inside the cockpit. At high altitude, the air is thin, almost fragile. Wings must move faster to stay aloft. Angles must be precise. There is no room for instinctive correction, only disciplined understanding. But discipline weakens when instruments argue with one another and alarms speak without clarity. The brain begins choosing the information it wants to believe. Inside the cockpit, attention fractured. Eyes jumped between screens that refused to agree. Numbers rose and fell without explanation. The aircraft felt heavy, as if the sky itself had thickened around it. Training said one thing. Sensation said another. Fear quietly rewrote priorities. The nose remained raised. With every second, the wings lost more lift. The aircraft's descent steepened, yet the sensation suggested something else entirely. Instead of feeling like a drop, it felt like resistance, like being held back by an invisible force. That false feedback reinforced the mistake, locking it in place. Stall warnings returned, then vanished again. The inconsistency eroded trust. When warnings cannot be trusted, they are ignored. When ignored, they become background noise, easily dismissed in favor of intuition. Intuition in this case was wrong. Below, the ocean waited in complete darkness, offering no visual reference, no horizon, no sense of distance. Above, stars remained cold and indifferent. The aircraft existed in a world without anchors, suspended between sky and sea, guided only by human interpretation. Minutes passed. The descent rate increased. The aircraft fell thousands of feet, then thousands more. Still the engines roared. Still the wings did not break. This endurance deepened the illusion that control remained. It suggested that whatever was happening, it was temporary. Inside the cabin, gravity shifted. Passengers felt their bodies press into seats, then lighten again. Loose objects drifted briefly before falling back down. The change was enough to trigger fear, but not enough to explain it. No announcement followed. Silence filled the space where reassurance should have been. Some passengers closed their eyes, convinced turbulence was passing. Others sensed something worse, an unnamed danger that refused to reveal itself. Parents tightened their arms. Strangers reached for handrests. Hope existed, but it was fragile. In the cockpit, oxygen masks were unnecessary. Air remained breathable. Visibility inside was perfect. Yet mental clarity continued slipping away. Stress narrowed perception, reducing complex problems into simple threats. The perceived threat was speed. The chosen response was still wrong. The nose stayed high. Aerodynamics do not negotiate. Once airflow separates from a wing, lift vanishes regardless of engine power. The aircraft was no longer flying forward through air. It was falling through it. Wings stalled, engines pushing uselessly against physics. The descent became undeniable. Vertical speed numbers climbed into terrifying territory. Even then, the situation resisted recognition. The idea of a sustained high-altitude stall felt impossible. It contradicted expectation, experience, and belief. Belief is powerful. Belief can override evidence. The aircraft shuddered slightly, not violently, just enough to signal distress. It was the sound of limits being crossed quietly. Still, recovery remained possible. A simple change in pitch could have restored airflow. A basic principle, taught early, repeated often, waited patiently. But patience ran out faster than understanding. Time compressed. Seconds felt longer than minutes. Every moment carried weight, not because it was dramatic, but because it was decisive. The difference between survival and catastrophe narrowed into inches of control movement. The ocean rose invisibly. Inside the cabin, panic found its voice. Cries emerged. Prayers formed. Fear became communal, spreading faster than any announcement ever could. People felt the aircraft's struggle in their bodies, even if their minds could not name it. The pilots were not careless. They were overwhelmed, Human limits had been reached in an environment that punished hesitation. The tragedy was not ignorance, but misinterpretation sustained too long. The aircraft continued descending, locked into a mistake that no longer felt optional, only necessary. Hope still existed. It existed in physics. It existed in the strength of the airframe. It existed in a correction that remained possible until the very end. But hope requires recognition, and recognition never came. The Atlantic remained unseen, silent, and close. By the time certainty arrived, it arrived too late. The aircraft had been descending for minutes, but now the rate no longer hid behind numbers or sensations. Gravity asserted itself plainly. The sky was no longer something the plane moved through. It was something the plane was losing. The engines continued to roar, loyal and powerful, pushing against air that no longer mattered. Power without lift became noise without meaning. Inside the cockpit, the realization finally took shape, not as clarity, but as dread. The conflicting data no longer argued. It aligned into a single, terrifying truth. The aircraft was stalled, fully, deeply, sustained at an altitude where recovery demanded immediate, decisive action. The most painful part of that realization was its simplicity. The solution was not complex. It did not require advanced calculation or extraordinary skill. It required a single action that felt wrong to the human body but right to the laws of flight. Lower the nose. Trade altitude for airflow. Let the wings breathe again. But time had been spent reinforcing the opposite belief. Muscles had learned the wrong lesson. The mind, exhausted by stress, hesitated at the exact moment hesitation became fatal. The ocean below remained invisible, but its presence pressed upward, heavy and unavoidable. The distance that once felt infinite had collapsed into seconds. Inside the cabin, chaos fully arrived. Loose items flew. Screams cut through the darkness. Fear became physical, shared, undeniable. Passengers no longer wondered if something was wrong. They knew, and in that knowing they searched desperately for reassurance that never came. The aircraft shuddered harder now, not violently, but with a rhythm that felt like surrender. The wings, starved of airflow, could not answer the engine's demand. Aerodynamics had drawn a line that human effort could not cross. Still, even now, survival remained technically possible. Physics had not closed the door completely. A final correction could still have worked. That truth makes this moment unbearable. As the plane fell, the cockpit filled with alarms that no longer contradicted each other. They screamed together, unified at last. The sound was overwhelming but also clarifying. It was the sound of reality no longer asking for interpretation. Hands moved, but not far enough, not fast enough. The nose lowered slightly, then rose again, caught between instinct and understanding. That hesitation lasted seconds. Seconds were all that remained. The ocean rushed upward unseen, its surface calm, its darkness absolute. There would be no visual warning, no sense of scale, just impact. In the cabin, some passengers braced. Others froze. Some held strangers. Some closed their eyes. In those final moments, humanity compressed into instinctive gestures of love, fear, and hope. Hope did not disappear. Hope existed right up until the end. It existed in the strength of the aircraft, which held together under forces it was never meant to face. It existed in the engines, which never failed. It existed in the laws of flight, which would have forgiven a late correction if it had been complete. But hope also requires timing. The final seconds passed without resolution. The aircraft struck the ocean not in a dramatic explosion, but in a sudden, violent end to motion. Darkness swallowed sound. The night above continued as if nothing had happened. When the world learned of the loss, questions followed quickly. How could this happen? How could a modern aircraft, flown by trained professionals, be lost without a single catastrophic failure? The answer was quieter than expected. Nothing broke. Everything worked, except understanding. Investigations would later reconstruct every moment. Data would be analyzed. Simulations would replay the flight thousands of times. And again, the same conclusion would emerge. The aircraft was flyable almost until the end. A small mistake, repeated and reinforced by confusion, grew into something irreversible. That is what makes this story unbearable. Not negligence, not recklessness, but humanity. The tragedy reshaped training around the world. Pilots learned to trust fundamentals over instinct, to recognize stalls even when they feel impossible, to to slow down mentally when everything demands speed. Lives were saved in the years that followed because of this loss. That is where the hope lives now, not in what was lost, but in what was learned. Above the Atlantic, the night returned to silence. But the lesson did not fade. It traveled forward in time, carried by every pilot who now understands that fear can be managed, confusion can be trained against, and that sometimes the hardest control input is the simplest one. Lower the nose. Breathe life back into the wings. Remember, the sky does not forgive misunderstanding, but it rewards humility. Morning came quietly, somewhere far from the crash site. Sunlight touched runways, windows, and wings that would fly safely that day. Airports woke up the way they always did, with rolling suitcases and half-finished coffees, with families saying goodbye and promising to return. The world moved forward, unaware that the night before had carved a permanent line through aviation history. For a long time, there were no answers, only absence. Search crews scanned endless water. Debris told fragments of a story, but not the story itself. Families waited for certainty they feared receiving. Names were read aloud. Seats remained empty. The loss was heavy because it felt impossible. How could something so advanced, so prepared, vanish into darkness without explanation? When the data recorders were finally recovered, silence gave way to truth. Every second of the flight was replayed, every movement measured, every sound analyzed. Investigators did not look for villains. They looked for understanding. What they found was not failure in metal or design, but vulnerability in the space where humans and machines meet. The aircraft had trusted its pilots. The pilots had trusted their senses. The senses had been wrong. That realization reshaped everything. Training manuals changed. Simulators evolved. Pilots around the world began practicing scenarios once thought too unlikely to matter. High-altitude stalls, conflicting airspeed, instrument disagreement in darkness, confusion without visual reference. What had once been theoretical became essential. This is how survival is born from tragedy. Every time a pilot now lowers the nose, instinctively fighting them, this story whispers in the background. Every time confusion appears and someone pauses to simplify instead of react, lives are quietly saved. The loss became a teacher, harsh but effective. That is the part most people never see. They see headlines and numbers. They see grief frozen in photographs. But they do not see the thousands of safe landings that followed. Because this mistake was understood instead of ignored. Hope rarely arrives loudly. It arrives later, in training rooms, in checklists, in calm decisions made under pressure by people who learned from others they never met. The passengers of that flight never reached their destination. But their journey did not end without purpose. Their final moments rewrote procedures that protect millions every year. Their loss drew a boundary future crews now recognize before crossing. This is not comfort, but it is meaning. The most heartbreaking pilot mistake was not pulling at the wrong moment. It was being human in a situation that punished humanity. Yet that same humanity refused to let the lesson fade. Aviation did not move on. It moved forward. And every aircraft that now flies through the night, every storm crossed safely, every confusion resolved with discipline instead of panic, carries a piece of that legacy silently within it. The sky remembers, not with anger, with instruction.